This afternoon we're going to start off with Sharon Donahe, and she's been focused on cemetery research in the county. She's got a number of publications, and I probably don't have them all on my list here, but amongst those is Families of St. Peter's Churchyard and Butch Family Cemetery, volumes 1 and 2, West Bainbridge Cemetery, and the North Afton Cemetery. So I'd like to welcome Sharon. Thank you very much for coming.
I'm not going to be talking about everything that's on the handout, but everything I am talking about will be on the handout. I'm going to be moving pretty fast, so if somebody was interested in something, I didn't want to frustrate you by not having an opportunity to know. Now, first, I'm going to provide a brief introduction of myself. I know quite a few people here, but there's another number that I don't know and may not know me, and why I'm up here talking about research techniques. I have been doing genealogical and local history research for about 4 years now. In the beginning, it was an extracurricular activity that I just fell into. It was not something that I ever expected to require as much time and energy. Now, as it happened, at one point, I was looking for something interesting to do when I spotted a genealogy course being taught at the Guernsey Memorial Library. The instructors were Dale Storms, who was one-time Chenango County historian, and Judy Wilson, who was a local genealogist. And my class included such history enthusiasts as May Smith, who was then the Chenango County historian, Dale Green, who worked with May as her research assistant, and Tom Lloyd, who was then the North City historian. The class turned out to be absolutely fascinating, and so it began. I learned as I went, and since then I've written 2 biographies, one for each of my parents, 7 books about the inhabitants of various local cemeteries, 2 books about local industries for the Chenango County Historical Society, and a number of articles for the CCHS Journal and other publications. Now, back sometime in the 1980s, when I was just beginning to learn how to do family history research, I attended a class in Washington, D.C. on the available national repositories. It was a week-long class, and on the last night, after the group dinner, we all gathered on the restaurant balcony overlooking the city of Washington. The leader of the class then spoke to us and said that his wish for us was that if we took nothing else away from the class, he wanted us to remember how important it was to publish our research, repeat of your message. And that we shouldn't think that we have to wait for it to be absolutely perfect or complete to do so. He went on to say that the very best way to preserve what we had accomplished was to publish it. So point 1, publish your research. Point 2, absolute perfection not required. Now, research some 40 years ago, before the prevalence of the internet, was quite different than today, although basic principles remain the same. Now today, more and more is becoming available on the internet, but the internet is not all-encompassing and not infallible, and so knowing how to find and use non-digitized resources is just as important today as it was 40 years ago. Let's see here. This didn't work, So first up, I'm going to talk about oral histories. Now, in the beginning, I used the technique of oral history interviews to capture some family history information, and these were done with both my parents and the one grandparent who was still alive at the time, as well as a few other family members. Now, another part of the message delivered on that Washington balcony many years ago was that it was important to publish sooner rather than do it later. Now, if that message didn't fully resonate with me at the time, the concept of not procrastinating was brought home with the project I did that resulted in my first publication, which was my father's autobiography. Now, sometime around 1990, something told me to put aside other projects and do my father's oral history. For about 6 months, starting in the fall of 1990, once a week I sat down with my father and asked him questions about his life and recorded the interviews. Between interviews, I would take the results and develop them into a chapter, which he would then review. We completed the interviews in the early spring of 1991. Then, on the week of the 4th of July, 1991, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. He went into rapid decline and passed away on Labor Day, 1991. During the time we were doing the interviews, there was nothing that I saw to tell me that anything might be wrong. So as it turned out, what had happened was that the time spent doing the interviews was the very last opportunity there would ever be to talk to him about his life. And as subsequent events showed, it was almost too late, and all of what was learned would have been lost. So point 3, don't procrastinate. Don't think you've got all the time in the world to get it done. This refers not only to consulting people, but also to accessing resources which can disappear in the blink of an eye through fire, floods, storms, theft, or just the ignorance of those in whose hands it might be who decide it's nothing anyone would be interested in, and so discard it. Now, oral histories are great whether you do them yourself or you review those done by others. And it's through interviews that I've heard a number of stories that I couldn't have heard or learned anywhere else. And I have just a few examples. Now, one example from my father's book demonstrates the human impact of an event which otherwise, at most, would have just been a dry statistic. Now, to give a little context, this slide shows my father at about the age he was when the event happened. Now, my father's parents were dairy farmers in Bainbridge, and during the 1920s and 30s, there was a bovine tuberculosis epidemic. It was legislated statewide that all milk-producing dairy cattle had to undergo screening for tuberculosis. Those cattle that gave positive results were taken by the state and destroyed. And unfortunately, my grandparents were caught by this epidemic. My father was about 10 years of age, and his recollections about this time were as follows in his words, quote, "When my parents' cows were tested around 1930, the results came in positive, resulting in the loss of their entire herd of approximately 20 head. The cattle taken by the state were driven to pens located on the eastern side of the village near the river where they were held until they could be transported to the facility which disposed of them. I can remember as a kid seeing neighbors' cows walking down what is now Route 206 into Bainbridge to the holding pens. And then one dreadful day, our cows took that walk. For my father, which would be my grandfather, the impact was absolutely devastating. The loss of his dairy herd was one blow that he could not take in his stride. As a result, he fell into a deep depression and completely withdrew from everything and everybody for a period of time. From the perspective of a child about 10 years of age, I thought he was going to die. And for a brief period of time, perhaps he wanted to. I specifically remember one day when he sat very still, not moving a muscle. I became frightened because I thought he actually had died right there." End quote. Now, this recollection gained via an oral history interview goes way beyond the simple statistic of the fact that my grandparents lost their cows to the bovine TB epidemic. Previously, I had absolutely no idea that it ever happened. Now, a couple of other examples come out of my interview with my grandfather, who was my mother's father, who was born in Germany in 1896 and immigrated to the United States in 1912 when he was 15 years of age. Now, here they are shortly after arrival in 1912 with family members who had arrived earlier. And my grandfather is the young man on your left. Yes. Now, one story he told me dealt with the death of his father. His father died in Germany in 1904 and was buried on a German holiday called Decoration Day. This was similar to the American holiday of Memorial Day. So on the day that his father was buried, there were a number of people at the cemetery for the purpose of decorating the graves and doing honor to their deceased family members. As a child of 8 years of age, my grandfather thought that everyone was there because of his father, and he was very impressed with the tremendous turnout. To him, this was evidence of how much everyone was, in his words, liking my father. This story presents, first of all, an image of my great-grandfather's funeral, and secondly, an image of my grandfather as a small boy at his father's funeral, vulnerable and not fully understanding everything that was happening around him. It expands on data that would otherwise have been just a date on the family tree. Now, another example from my grandfather's interviews deals with their arrival at Ellis Island. Now, anyone who has done much research on Ellis Island knows the arrival there didn't guarantee entry into the U.S. If for any reason it was thought that a person would be a burden or a threat to society, they were immediately sent back to where they came from. And this could result in families who had given up everything to come to America being permanently separated. Parents and children were not exempt from this fate. Now, the immigrants were undergoing inspection as soon as they entered the processing facility, and anyone who looked medically or mentally deficient or otherwise suspicious was removed from the line for a more comprehensive evaluation. Now, my grandfather was with his younger brother, mother, and stepfather. During their processing, his mother was separated from the rest of the family to undergo a more extensive medical evaluation. Now, it's probable that she was singled out because she had a curved spine and a humped back as the result of a childhood injury. Now, my grandfather expressed two emotions relative to this. First, he said he was frightened. And second, he was very annoyed and most indignant since he said she was in perfect health and thought the inspector should have known that. Now, given what is known about Ellis Island, my grandfather's words of being frightened are clearly an understatement of what he and the other family members must have been feeling when his mother was separated from the rest of them. They did it happily when she passed her exam and she was allowed to enter the U.S. with the rest of the family. Now, my grandfather did write his autobiography, which has been very helpful, but he did not include the story of coming through Ellis Island in his writings. So without talking to him and asking about his life, it would never have been known. The fact would have simply been recorded that they entered the U.S. through Ellis Island with no knowledge or understanding of the drama that they experienced. Now, there's a wealth of guidance out there for doing oral history interviews, and there's some on the handout here. If you do a Google search for oral history guidance, plenty of possibilities will come up for consideration, and then you can just select what feels most comfortable for you. On to the internet. There are a ton of internet resources available for finding out about just about anything, many of which are growing daily. I'm only going to highlight several that I use frequently. I'll start with subscription sites, which you see here, and I'll only hit the high points for each site. And if any are of interest, and you're not already familiar with them, I'd encourage going to the site and exploring to see what they offer. Now, frequently, a subscription site will offer an opportunity for a few free days to determine if it's something you want to subscribe to. Ancestry.com, a very popular website with an extensive database. It is the first place that I go when researching an individual, and it's a site that I'm into just about every day. To do a search, you put in what information you know about your person of interest. The search then provides links to data in the categories that are listed on the slide. And the search results won't necessarily be specific to your person, so it does require some sorting through the search results to select the data and information of interest. It is possible to refine a search by designating that the search be exact for particular criteria, such as their name, where they live, and when or where they were born, etc. The result can be some great finds, such as actual copies of primary documents, birth records, death certificates, marriage records, probate records, military records, and others. Now, one thing that the Ancestry site includes are family trees, which are submitted by the site's subscribers. Other sites also have family trees, but I generally use Ancestry's collection just as a matter of habit more than anything else. There are those who do this sort of research who proclaim that because family trees are frequently unreferenced and error-prone, they would never consult them. While this is true, I do not hold this opinion. However, it is important to recognize that errors do occur. And just because someone has put their family tree out there doesn't mean it's accurate or properly sourced. But a family tree can provide clues for future research, which is what I use them for. Now this is an example of errors in a family tree. And this family tree was submitted for Asa Lesueur, who is, it was submitted for Asa Lesueur, who is my 3 times great-grandfather. The specific issue, Asa Lesueur was born in 1788. That's correct, as his primary Vermont birth record, available on Ancestry confirms. But then, this person says that he was married to Phoebe Collins in 1789, when he would have been all of 1 year of age. Now, Phoebe Collins was his wife, but she was born in 1795, which is 6 years after her reported marriage in 1789. Now, the other, less obvious issue is the identification of another wife, which I know from my own research never happened. Now, what can happen when such errors occur is the proliferation of the error across multiple family trees and into publications. Now, in Ancestry, there are over 90 trees that have been submitted for Asa Lesueur, and some of which contain these exact same errors. It's obvious that other family tree owners simply picked up this information and attached it to their family tree without a critical review, as, in my opinion, this is a pretty easy error to spot. In such a manner, erroneous data can become so embedded in the family story that it becomes extremely difficult to correct. So even if a piece of data appears over and over in various resources, doesn't mean that it represents the truth, unless properly sourced. You always need to maintain a critical eye and not assume that just because someone has put it out there that it represents the true story. However, many of Ancestry's trees are excellent, and after doing this for a while, it's possible to develop an instinct for spotting when a researcher has put particular care into developing an accurate family tree. However, I would never give someone else's family tree as a reference, but I would review it to see if it provides any clues which can lead me to further research, and that's my purpose in using family trees developed by others. Now, AmericanAncestors.org is the site for the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and you need to be a member of the society to gain access. Now, this site has a wealth of information on early New England, but that's not all. In recent years, they have expanded their data collection to include other areas outside New England, including New York. Now, NEHGS has an extensive genealogical library, stacks upon stacks of material, family histories, local histories, unpublished manuscripts, which they are now gradually digitizing and putting up on the website for access. They also publish a journal a few times a year with a focus on colonial New England, and their work is very scholarly and thoroughly referenced, and back copies of the journal are digitized, searchable, and available on their website. Just as with Ancestry, you input what you know about your person of interest, and the search will bring up hits in these categories. They're listed there. Now, the Great Migration Study is worth a special mention. The project seeks to identify all immigrant Europeans to New England from 1620 forward. The goal is to provide a concise, reliable summary of past research on the early immigrants to New England. This reduces the amount of time which must be spent by a researcher in discovering past work and provides a foundation for future work. So if you have managed to carry your history back to an immigrant New England ancestor from the 1600s, this would be a definite place to check. Fold3.com is a site for military records for all major U.S. conflicts as listed on your left, is that right? On your left. And hits will come up in the categories on your right. Now, one item which is of particular interest that I've used quite a bit are the pension documents. Revolutionary veteran pension applications are all available, and some Civil War documents are beginning to come online. These can provide a bonanza of information, and what I especially like are the declarations in the soldier's own words as to his military experience. In the case of a widow's pension, proof of marriage is necessary, and the identities and birthdates of children are often provided. Now, before the internet, pension records were ordered from the National Archives at up to $100 a pop, and they still can be. I've got a whole collection of hard copy pension records I purchased for soldiers I've researched over the years. It's still necessary to go to the National Archives for those pension records not yet digitized for the internet. Now, what I use most often in genealogybank.com are the Social Security Death Index and the newspaper archive. Now, Social Security was created by the Social Security Act of 1935 and signed into law by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So if researching anyone after that time, a check of the SSDI is appropriate. In the beginning, not everyone was included, such as a housewife who never worked outside the home, and so never had an employer paying into Social Security for her benefit. So it shouldn't be surprising when a search comes up negative, particularly in the early years of Social Security prior to the 1960s. Information provided includes birth date and place, death date, and last residence. And using these clues, it's possible to check other sources for additional information. Now, the Social Security Administration holds microfilm copies of applications and claim files which contain data filed with the administration via the application or claims process. Photocopies can be obtained for a cost of some $20+. And this is by submitting a Freedom of Information Act request through their website. Additional information may include the applicant's full name, parents' names, spouses' names, and any name changes over the years. Now, Ancestry has an online database of transcriptions of data from the applications and claims files, which covers 1936 to 2007. The caveat is the transcriptions are not perfect and dependent on the transcriber being able to accurately read the original. This is not a given, and I've routinely been entering corrections in Ancestry when I come across an error, most commonly found in transcriptions of the census records. Now, the newspaper archive I'll speak more about shortly. Suffice it to say, the Genealogy Bank's newspaper database is extensive. And for the U.S. Census, Genealogy Bank has images of the originals for all federal censuses, beginning with the first in 1790. As to the last two categories, government publications and historical books, I won't talk much about these other than to provide this list of examples of what can be accessed in those categories. Now, on to the free sites. FamilySearchorg. This is the site for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, for whom genealogy is a component of their faith. One of the core tenets of the Mormon faith is that the dead can be baptized after their passing, resulting in sealing the family together throughout eternity. They trace their family trees to find the names of ancestors so that these relatives from past generations can be baptized by proxy. Hence, they have expended extensive efforts collecting data for many years, and their collection is freely available at the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, which is pictured here. With the coming of the internet, they have been gradually putting their extensive collection online, with all of it free for the looking. Now, the USGen web project was initiated in 1996 by a group of genealogists to create free online resources for genealogical research. The service has grown into a network of over 3,000 linked websites, all individually created and maintained by a community of volunteers. Today, you may find a unique county or state resource including photos, maps, transcriptions, historical documents, and much more. Volunteers work together to provide free genealogy websites for research in every state and every county in the United States. And naturally, some sites are better than others. It all depends on the dedication and enthusiasm of the volunteers. And in New York State, an example of an exemplary USGen website is the Delaware County site, which shows what can be done. Now, the WorldGenWeb.org is the same idea as the USGen Web. It's a nonprofit, volunteer-based organization dedicated to providing genealogical and historical records and resources for worldwide access. The approach and principles are the same as the USGen Web. And the website's homepage provides an extensive list of countries that are included with links to those countries' GenWeb websites. Now the next site, which is TimeandDate.com. It's a calculator that answers the question, what day is it? Now sometimes a marriage notice or a bit will say, so-and-so was married or died or whatever, last Tuesday, for example. Knowing the date of the source, such as a newspaper edition, it's possible to use this online calculator to figure out the date of last Tuesday. The calculator will provide the day of the week for the known date from which last Tuesday can be determined. Now the next site is referred to as a tombstone birthday calculator. In the absence of birthday information, the age given on a tombstone or in a death record or news notice, when expressed in years, months, and days, can be used to determine an estimate of the birth date. The death date and age data are entered into the calculator, which then calculates the birth date. Since this is not a primary source, when I use this in a write-up, I will always state that the birth date is based on the age at death as recorded in whatever source it came from. Now this, Local History Notes, is my blog. My purpose of the blog is to share news items from various sources regarding the southern tier of New York State. The goal is to provide a researcher with a missing data point that then helps them further develop their family history. I started it in 2013 by posting my grandmother's archive of news clippings, of which she had a bunch, as did other members of the family, which had also been posted. Since then, I have posted many historical items that I've come across during the course of my research, not only obituaries and marriage notices, but stories of local history and other interesting items that I come across. Now, my current project on the blog is posting local marriage and death notices as published in early local newspapers. And I started with a newspaper edition published in 1850. Now, in New York State, vital records were not recorded with the town clerk until the 1880s, except for a brief period in the late 1840s. So it can be difficult to find someone's data prior to then, particularly if you're not sure exactly when any of that occurred. Now, this particular project is an effort to get such data out there for a period of time which has no official index. I'm expecting to continue through the early 1880s when the available New York State vital record indices will take over. Now, you may wonder, why bother? A researcher can go to the online newspaper and do a search to find this data. While this is true, it's not perfect, because there are circumstances where you won't get a hit, even when you're looking for is there. This is because newspaper images are not perfect, because the newspaper printing process wasn't perfect. The print may be blurred, have ink blobs, missing letters, be too light or too dark, and because newspapers are printed on both sides of a sheet of paper, the print from one side may bleed through to the other side, thus confusing the search engine. So in these circumstances, even though your search item may be there, the search engine won't see it. It requires physically going through the newspaper to find your item. Thus far on the blog, I have progressed to 1863, which is right in the middle of the Civil War. And consequently, I have been coming across published letters from soldiers in the field. So another thing that is being added to the blog currently are transcriptions of these letters. Now, there are plenty of overviews of the Civil War written by those in charge or historians, but there is nothing that brings the soldier's experience home better than a personal account in the soldier's own words. As an example, the First Battle of Bull Run, fought on July 21st, 1861, marked the first major land battle of the American Civil War. The battle was a Confederate victory, and in letters written after the battle, the Union soldiers tell of what happened to them during the course of the battle, how they were overcome by the Confederates, and how they had to flee for their lives with the Confederates hot on the trail. More than one soldier tells of how the Confederate soldiers killed wounded Union soldiers when they came upon them on the field. As an example, one soldier wrote, quote, "I never should, or never could, have suspected a people reared as they have been under the blessings of Christianity and civilization to be possessed of such inhuman cruelty. I don't know as I ever read of anything more cruel than to deliberately pull wounded men out of the wagons and cut their throats. Every wounded man they came across on the battlefield, they would either cut his throat or run him through with a bayonet." End quote. Another soldier provided a very graphic description of what he saw on the battlefield when he wrote, quote, "I was among the wounded, where of all the sights one ever saw, that best all. Lead me up to a masked battery, face to face with the enemy, but deliver me from another such a place as that. Those groans still ring in my ears and always will. As you pass along, you will see one gasping for breath, another crying for water, another begging you to blow his brains out and put him out of his misery. Some have their limbs blown off, others part of their faces off. Then you will pass by one already in the cold embrace of death. You may read, but you cannot imagine a thing about it." End quote. Such first-hand information doesn't come from official reports. In another case, I had found and posted 3 letters written by a young soldier, Oscar Phelps of Greene, and through reading the letters, I kind of got to know this young man. Then I came across his death notice, which was stated that he died of typhoid fever just a few months after the last letter. Because of his letters, it kind of became a personal loss, even though it happened almost 160 years ago. Now, the purpose of posting the letters is to make them more accessible to anyone interested in learning more about the Civil War era from the view of the soldier on the lines. And there are plenty of Civil War enthusiasts out there who are very interested in all things related to the Civil War. Now, Cindy's List was initiated in March 1996 by Cindy Engel, who lives in Washington State. The site is defined as a card catalog to the genealogical collection in the immense internet library. In other words, it's a research portal that provides a comprehensive, categorized, and cross-referenced index to resources on the internet relating to genealogy or topics of historical interest. There are over 300,000 links for 229 different categories, from vital records to history to maps to wills and probate and many others. One important fact is that the site is updated on a daily basis. It's difficult to describe the extent and the value of this site, so the best way to get an appreciation is to visit and just look around. Now, before I leave the internet, I want to mention these folks. Reclaim the Records is a not-for-profit activist group of genealogists, historians, researchers, and open government advocates. They identify important genealogical records that should be in the public domain, but are being wrongly restricted by government archives, libraries, and agencies. They also go after databases that are currently online, but only accessible through subscription sites, where subscribers have to pay sometimes up to hundreds of dollars for access. What they do is they first file a Freedom of Information and Open Data request for a database of interest. If the pertinent authority doesn't comply, they take them to court. When successful, they digitize everything they acquire and put it all online for free access. Their website provides information about ongoing requests and lawsuits, and also access to the databases they've been successful in retrieving. They also describe the process they went through for any successful challenge, and their descriptions are very readable and really interesting. Now to date, they have been successful in retrieving over 30 million records, and this list are some of the successful challenges they've achieved for New York State. But they're not restricted to New York State, but will go after any government authority who they feel is unfairly or illegally restricting access to databases which belong in the public domain. On to newspapers. I do a lot of newspaper research. I especially like it because it can provide contemporary information for a person, event, or situation, and can also be the only source of information on a given subject. Now, an example of a recent project that made extensive use of newspaper research is the Bennett Ireland History Project, which I completed this past year for the Chenango County Historical Society. It was at least 75% accomplished through newspaper research. This was necessary because there was no surviving archive to be consulted, and the majority of the company's workers and leaders were no longer around. Bits and pieces were found in various archives, and while there were some useful items, there was minimal information about the company's story, which is what I was after. How they came to be, who were their leaders and shakers, and what were the experiences that the business came through. So the majority of the information used to develop the story of Bennett Ireland was obtained by extensive newspaper research. Of course, the caveat of doing newspaper research is that just because it's in print doesn't mean it's true. So it's important to once again apply a critical eye. Now, many historic newspapers are becoming available online. And these are some, on the list here, these are some of the newspaper sites that I routinely use. Now, for subscription sites, there is the Genealogy Bank, which I've already mentioned, which has an extensive database of U.S. newspapers covering every state in the Union, plus Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. The Newspaper Archive is a global database covering some 47 countries. And newspaper.com is also a global database with a limited number of countries as listed here. Now, for the free sites. A site which I find particularly valuable for doing historic research in New York State is the New York State Historic Newspaper site, which covers every county in New York, providing free online access to a wide range of early newspapers. If we look at Chenango County, these are the newspapers that are currently available on the site. Now, other states have similar databases, not exactly the same, but the same idea. And to find them, I will frequently do a Google search for historic newspapers in whatever locale I'm interested in at the time. Also of use for finding newspapers is Cindy's list that I previously mentioned. To locate a newspaper in a specific locale, you click on the locale of interest. For example, United States, California, that's what you're interested in, the newspapers. And up come links for all the sites identified about California newspapers, or whatever site you're interested in. Now, Advantage Archives. This is a free site, but unlike the others previously discussed, the owners do not go out on their own and search out newspapers to digitize. They contract with organizations such as a library or historical society to digitize and upload to the web for access, meaning the organization pays them to put their collection online. Now, I worked with a friend of mine to get the newspaper collection held by the Bainbridge Historical Society done by Advantage Archives. The BHS newspaper collection is wonderful and extensive, and I have been using it as hard copy for some time, traveling over to Bainbridge to use it in their facility, and along the way frequently thinking how nice it would be if the collection was digitized and hence more easily searchable. rather than going through the issues page by page as was necessary with the hard copy. There was also the concern that something might happen to the collection, such as a roof leak over the shelving where the newspapers were stored. They were damaged, but next time they might not be so lucky. So, my friend and I sponsored the digitizing and uploading of the VHS newspaper collection as a donation to the Bainbridge Historical Society. And I have been happily using the database ever since. I didn't mind the trip over to Bainbridge, but it's so much nicer to immediately consult the database when an idea strikes rather than have to wait for the opportunity to visit the hard copy collection. There is a whole range of other U.S. newspapers available on Advantage Archives, and I've counted over 30 New York State counties for which Advantage Archives has placed newspapers online. And they've not only done New York State, but every state in the country. Now, repositories. While it's true that there is a wealth of information available online, meaningful research cannot stop there. Traveling to brick-and-mortar repositories is essential. It's a fact that many times the best source of information about a given family or individual is obtained by visiting an historian, historical society, or library in the locale where your subject lives. So it's important to turn off the computer and do a little traveling. Now, I'm not going to go into any details about repositories because I suspect that this particular audience knows much more about them than I do. Suffice it to say that this area has some excellent repositories, both in public facilities such as libraries and in the collections of local historical societies and historians, and I've traveled to many. I will mention one experience that demonstrates how the unexpected can occur when visiting a brick-and-mortar facility. One time, I was in the Chenango County historian's office when it was located next door in the basement of the museum. I was doing research on one of my cemetery projects. Also there at the same time was another woman who was seeking burial information, burial site information for Joel J. Bixby, who was prominent in Norwich at one time. Now, she may not have known that the Bixbys came to Norwich from Bainbridge. Even though Joel lived in Norwich for many years and died here, he was buried in Bainbridge in the family plot in St. Peter's Cemetery. Now, St. Peter's is one of the cemeteries I have written a couple of books about, and I just happen to have the cemetery transcription that I have done with me since I was there researching the people of St. Peter's. After listening to her and those trying to help her getting increasingly frustrated in their search for the final resting place of the elusive Joel J. Bixby, I spoke up and ended up giving her a copy of my transcription, which included the relative she was looking for, including Joel J. Bixby. Coincidence that we were both there at the same time and I had exactly what she needed? Perhaps. But be ready to accept the unusual or the unexpected. Cemeteries. It was mentioned that I've done a lot of cemetery research. I do quite a bit of work transcribing cemeteries and then researching the residents therein. The data gathered from cemeteries may be the only evidence that someone ever existed, particularly in the early years of settlement. In addition to transcribing, each stone is photographed. That way, if I have a question about the transcription, I can move the photo rather than travel back to the cemetery. And sometimes the camera can see the stone better than I can when standing right in front of it. A photograph also provides a permanent visual record of the stone and its transcription. Unfortunately, stones do and have disappeared, in which case a photographic record is important to show that it ever existed. Newspaper research is done to search for death notices, obituaries, marriage announcements, and news items about activities and anything else of interest. For those who died in the early to mid-1800s, newspaper items are rarely available or limited in content. So I'll do some genealogical research to learn what I can about who they were, where they came from, and who they belonged to. The purpose is to provide family researchers with some data and information they can then apply to further research. To date, I've published 7 cemetery books, each of which contains an up-to-date cemetery transcription, plus a compilation of collected data and information about those buried there. And number 8 is currently in the works. And there's about 9 more cemeteries that I've transcribed waiting in the wings. Now sometimes when doing cemetery research, a mystery appears, such as is the case of a stone found in White Store's Evergreen Cemetery, upon which is inscribed, quote-unquote, mother, with no further identification. Now this is a regular-sized stone, not a footstone. And this is when the cemetery itself provides the clues that enable solving the mystery. First, the stone does specify the woman's death date and age. Applying the principle that in general strangers are not buried together, it was noted that the mother stone was located within a group of stones for the Ballou family. Taking that clue and researching the Ballou family, discovery was made of Amy Payne Ballou. Her death date and age on the stone essentially agreed with Amy's data from the New York State Death Index and her published death notice. Looking again about the cemetery, it was noted that the mother stone was located near tombstones for Sylvanus Ballou, Amy's husband, and her son, Andrew Ballou. Without the clues that the cemetery itself provided, this mystery may not have been able to be solved. Now, doing this work, I've come across some incredible stories. For example, in general, it can be said that in every cemetery that I've researched, there is at least one poor soul whose life was taken by another. In other words, they were murdered. In North Afton, it was Alonzo Phillips, who was shot during a horning of a newly married couple. In South Upselic, there is Tilla Minor, who was shot by a jealous boyfriend. In St. Peters, there is Elliot J. Kidder, who was shot during a land dispute. In West Bainbridge, there is Eldridge Davis, who was ambushed and shot by an apparent robber. And also in West Bainbridge, there is Mary Helen Searles, who was poisoned by her husband, and so on. Every time I come across such a situation, I will research it to learn what actually happened, primarily using newspaper research. At one time, the newspapers had stenographers in the courtroom during the trial, resulting in full trial transcripts being published in great detail in the next edition. In such research, these proved very useful. Cemeteries also have a number of military burials, which I will research as thoroughly as possible to learn what they may have experienced. Out of this, some incredible stories have come. For example, White Store, with its 20 Revolutionary soldiers, has the example of John Eastwood, who at the age of 18 was serving as a ranger and scout. In 1780, he was taken prisoner by the British and Indians and incarcerated at a place called Prisoner's Island in Quebec. He would be imprisoned there for almost 3 years until escaping. After his escape, he found his way home, arriving there unannounced and totally unexpected at the end of September 1783. He had been absent from home, first as a soldier and then as a prisoner of war, for a total of about 3.5 years. His family had heard nothing from him from the time he was taken prisoner, or for almost 3 years. It was long since they had concluded the worst, and he had been given up for dead. And his presumed death had long since been mourned by family and friends. His surprise appearance after 3 years of total silence was undoubtedly, seemingly, a return from the dead. And there are other stories as well that don't involve murder or the military. Stories of tragedy, triumph, perseverance, and accomplishment. For example, there's the story of Rachel Palmer of St. Peter's Cemetery, who epitomized tremendous perseverance and strength in the face of adversity. She was the mother of 8 children. Over a period of about 3 weeks, in October 1862, she lost 4 children to a virulent diphtheria epidemic. And then 2 sons were lost in the Civil War. And then a 3rd son died in a lumbering accident when a tree fell on him. Of her 8 children, only 1 survived her. Also, evidence suggests that Rachel and her husband would separate, and that her husband at some point ran afoul of the law and did jail time. So Rachel was given more than her share of misfortune, and yet she demonstrated tremendous strength of character and courage, and despite her many sorrows, was described as positive and cheerful. She was also quite feisty, and lived to the age of 93 years. And then there's Joseph Pearsall, Bainbridge native, who went west in the era of the gold rush and became a well-known prospector known as the human mountain goat because he would readily venture into areas others thought too dangerous. He struck it rich in the Cascade Mountains, but sold out because he preferred the search to the game. Now, I have written his story up, and it will be published in the next edition of the Chenango County Historical Society Journal, which will be out this summer. And John C. Clark, a member of the United States Congress in the early 1800s, survived significant political opposition, demonstrating the politics was just as contentious then as it is now. Also, Olive Kirby, a beautiful, vivacious, and popular young woman who was lost to the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, a situation that sounds much like what has been experienced recently, thanks to COVID. And then James Randall Stack, a descendant of the founders of the Gliding Corporation, a Princeton graduate, an engineer, a young man with many plans for his future that were interrupted by World War II. He was lost at sea when a ship sank after being bombed by a Japanese airplane pilot. His remains were never recovered as he went down with the ship. But the family erected a memorial bench in Valley View Cemetery in South Zealand. And the last example, the Toposian family of South Zealand, who survived what is historically known as the Armenian genocide that resulted in the devastation of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire. And many, many more stories to be found beneath the stones. You just never know when an incredible story will come to light when doing cemetery research. Now, my last category is consultations, which are one of the best resources to be found. Consultations with local historians have always been very helpful, with most of the historians that I've consulted being very generous with their assistance. Now, in the case of the Bennett Ireland project, I was able to consult with Kent Turner, who was a member of the founding family and one-time executive officer of Bennett Ireland. He answered questions and reviewed the manuscript prior to publication. He did have a couple of issues with some of the newspaper reports and gave me the correct information to make the presentation as accurate as possible. The Bennett Ireland book also included chapters on the Ireland Foundry and Norwich Wire Works. And consultations with descendants of the founders of both organizations resulted in the provision of family photographs and other materials which proved invaluable to the preparation of those presentations. The I.R. Richard History Project, also done for the Chenango County Historical Society, had a similar experience with a collaboration with John Mitchell, who was the former CEO of the company, who generously shared the available company archive, contributed information, and reviewed the manuscript, again providing some corrections on certain newspaper reports. And these are just a very few examples of successful consultations I've had over the years. Experience has shown that there should never be any hesitation about making an approach to ask for help. The worst they can do is ignore you, which has happened, or say no, neither of which is the end of the world. And lastly, I will quickly go through the research approach taken to the recent breaking of a brick wall, which shows how following the clues and how the availability of new resources, courtesy of the internet, finally solved a mystery of many years' duration. The question: who was Phoebe Collins, the wife of Asa LeSueur? Asa and Phoebe are my 3 times great-grandparents. And because they are in my direct line, I had already spent quite a bit of time some years ago trying to answer this question without success, and had to finally admit defeat and set it aside. This is probably some 20 to 30 years ago. Now, my current cemetery project is for Eastside Cemetery in Afton, where Asa and Phoebe LeSueur are buried. So I now had another opportunity to tackle the question, should I choose to take it? Now, since my initial attempts, the internet happened. So I thought, or hoped, there just might be a chance that something was now available that would finally help in identifying Phoebe's family. First step was to review what I knew about Asa and Phoebe LeSueur. Asa was born in Vermont in 1788, and the family came to Unadilla at an early day. Phoebe was born in 1795, location is currently unconfirmed, and her maiden name was Collins. They were married prior to 1815 when their first child was born. Asa and Phoebe LeSueur lived in Unadilla for an extended time, and most of their children were born there. So a clue. Maybe Phoebe also lived in Unadilla prior to her marriage to Asa. and that Unadilla was where I needed to look to find her family. The timing was prior to 1850, when the census listed only the head of household, so I wasn't going to find Phoebe listed as a young girl in her parents' home. What's to do? I went looking in the early censuses, 1800 and 1810, in Unadilla for a man whose surname was Collins, who was the appropriate generation to be Phoebe's father, and whose delineation of household members included a female of about the proper age to be Phoebe. After sorting through several Collins men, I settled on this gentleman, Chedor Lamer Collins of Unadilla, who was the proper age to be Phoebe's father. I then did an ancestry search on Chedor Collins, but the only child that came up was a son, Jared Collins. This was a bummer, and at other times could have been the end of the search. But experience has shown that women can become invisible to the family once they are married and change their names, and so I didn't give up hope that Chedor was the guy. I learned that Chedor Collins was a Revolutionary War veteran. Revolutionary pension records are now available on the internet. Did Chedor have a pension record? Yes, he did. And after his death, his widow, identified in the pension file as Sarah Severance, also received a pension. Reviewing the pension records now available on the internet, it was learned that when his widow died, there were still some outstanding pension funds that she was entitled to that she had never received. It was legislated that her children were entitled to receive the arrears of pension due her at the time of her decease. And so her son, Jared Collins, petitioned that the arrears be distributed to her surviving children, and those children were listed in the petition. The petition showed that at the time of Sarah Collins' death, she had 3 surviving children, her son, Jared Collins, and 2 daughters, Sarah Collins Sisson and Phoebe Collins LeSueur of Bainbridge. Since Asa and Phoebe LeSueur are associated with Afton, the mention of Bainbridge could have raised a doubt. However, the year was 1850, and it was a fact that at that time, Afton was known as South Bainbridge. So, it was time for a hallelujah moment. After all these years, Phoebe Collins LeSueur was identified, question answered, brick wall demolished. Basically, it's all about following the clues, knowing as much as possible about the locale and the era, and never giving up. New data are becoming available all the time, and sometimes it's necessary to put a question aside and then pick it up at a later time, either with a new perspective or when new data surfaces. And with that, the end.